What better place can there be to start a tour of Ukrainian American heritage than in a small community called Kief? However, it's spelled K-I-E-F because it was founded by a number of Black Sea Germans. Now, this community of Kief has an unusual character because it shows many of these early settlers had a complex interrelation with how they identified. Here, at least in this community, the church behind me is the Liberty Baptist Church in Kief, about 100 years old. Now, these are people who identified with the Kiefan governorate, and many of them were influenced very heavily by Black Sea Germans, but the community by and large was a mix of some Germans, but mostly native Ukrainians who had been writing in the Russian language because they were proponents of a new branch of Christianity that emerged in the latter half of the 1800s, the Shtundists. Now, the Shtundists drew heavily from German Mennonites, Baptists, Pietists, and a little bit from the native spiritual Christians right there in the Russian Empire. But usually, when they came to places like America, they would identify simply as Baptists. Their history is fascinating, but ethnically, they were mostly Ukrainian, drawing heavily from German sources.
Well, my great-grandpa and grandpa, they came from Kiev, Russia.
Well, it's just interesting because I've spoken to a few people who identify as Ukrainian or Russian or German.
Well, they always said we were Russian until whenever here they said something about you're a Ukrainian now. So we were half of my years have been for Russian, and then half of them were for Ukraine. So far, anyhow, they might change again. Who knows?
Hopefully, it remains Ukraine.
Yeah.
Built in 1901, this Baptist church actually uses similar hipped roof style to many early Ukrainian pioneers. And you can see here on the sign, it says the Kief First Baptist Church, 1901, organized as Liberty Baptist, the first Russian Baptist church in the United States of America. Now, the reason that they identified it as Russian at the time is because this spiritual movement, when it began in the middle of the 1800s, at that point, it was part of the Russian Empire, and it was forbidden to publish official documents in the Ukrainian language because the Tsar, at least by the 1880s, was a lot more reactionary and wanted to basically stamp out Ukrainian culture, a running theme among the Russians. But the Ukrainians saw that it was easy enough for them to publish materials in Russian because they wanted this movement, this Protestant movement that was inspired by the German religious revival of the 1850s, to sweep across the Russian Empire. That was their hope. I'll go into the finer details of the theology, but the etymology of the Shtundists is pretty interesting. They were Ukrainians writing in Russian, and they drew heavily from the Germans, the Black Sea Germans, and the German word Stund, or hour, is in reference to the fact that these folks would spend about 1 hour every day at a minimum at Bible study. And it was basically a way to call them nerds. It was saying, oh, you're just going to sit down and read your Bible for an hour. It was considered a derogatory term, but eventually the Shtundists kind of embraced this term, at least among themselves. And although they called themselves Baptists, or sometimes Mennonites, among themselves, at least among the older generation, there's a lot of references to the fact that they kind of took this term on their own.
Let's see, my dad's parents, they were from Ukraine. And they lived out south, about 10 miles out here, or 8 or whatever, on the homestead. That's where they made their farm. And then there was, and Jeed and Baba, where we lived, my folks, when they got married, they got their farm, and they moved to Minot. And that was out in, south of the Grandma Pauline and Anton. It was out down in the hills, down in Omaha.
The fact that they embraced the term Shtundists is very similar, I think, to how the Jesus freaks took that label. I also want to say there's a fascinating and overlooked history with the Shtundists during World War II. This was a sort of predecessor movement to a lot of early Protestant evangelical churches in Ukraine and the former Soviet Union, and because of their close relation as basically kind of outcast or peasant communities, they had interesting tangential relations with the Jewish community. So throughout the war, many of them actually helped hide Jewish neighbors. This Ukrainian Protestant movement really began in the early 1850s with a revival among the religious folks of the German settlers. These were the Black Sea Germans, and this revival saw the Lutherans and Mennonites showing up to their own communities and reading the Bible in plain German. This was something that was sort of unheard of to the native Ukrainians whose land they had settled on. And the Germans, by the way, had settled there at the invitation of Catherine the Great. This is actually pretty interesting because Catherine the Great is still celebrated in a lot of circles as someone who helped to settle the Russian Empire. I just saw the huge statue of her at the Central Park in Tiraspol in Moldova, or Pridnestrovia, whichever one you want to call it.
The town on the river Dniester, because these Black Sea shore conquests of the Russians were part of so-called Greek project. The idea of this concept was to destroy Ottoman Empire and revive the Byzantine one with the capital in Constantinople. So I guess the Turkish guy, that's why he was telling harsh things about Catherine on the map of the world, because Russians took in partition the same part as Prussia, if I could pronounce it correctly in English. In German it's Preußen Königkeit, in Russian it's Королевство Prussia, and Austrian Empire, of course.
Now, this is something that the Ukrainians were very interested in. Obviously, they had the Orthodox Church, and usually their preachers were reading in Old Church Slavonic, a language that they could understand but really had no bearing on their day-to-day lives. But when they saw these Germans showing up just to read and talk about the message of the Bible, some of them began to turn back to their priests and say, "Why is it that you're reading to us in a language that we really don't understand, and there's no back and forth communication?" Meanwhile, a lot of the Orthodox priests were even themselves semi-literate, and this is right before the emancipation of the serfs, and you couldn't really ask questions like this as a Ukrainian or a Russian peasant, because you would just be told to listen to the priest and take what he said as gospel, literally. Among native Ukrainians, the Protestant revival really began with Ivan Onyshenko. Onyshenko was a tailor from Khersonskaya Gubernia, which was a part of the Russian Empire at the time. He left his original church in 1858 and began to form close friendships and friendly relations with the German Black Sea settlers. However, the Germans were forbidden from proselytizing. They could have friendships with the locals and talk about religion, but they couldn't actually convert them and bring them into their own churches. So the Germans told Ivan Onyshenko, "We'll give you a Bible in the Russian language," because there was no Ukrainian translation available to them. Again, the Tsar said you cannot convert the locals. So Ivan, who's now in his 40s, taught himself how to read in order to spread this new faith. And his first adherent was a man named Mikhail Ratsunev, who was also his apprentice in the tailoring business. By the way, you can see Ratsunev right here on the left in this picture. So you can see that this movement gradually began to form around the tailor Ivan Onyshenko in the last few years of the 1850s. But in 1861, the serfs were officially emancipated in the Russian Empire. So Ivan Onyshenko's apprentice, Mikhail, begins to travel throughout Ukraine, speaking in his native tongue, but publishing Russian literature. On the face of it, he's saying that he is a peddler of goods, but in reality, he is secretly building up a church. This had been going on for a few years, and in 1861, when the serfs had finally been liberated, they began to get a little bit more open with their opposition to religious authorities of the Russian Empire. This culminated in the early 1860s with them literally removing the icons and religious items from their homes, piling them in their front yards, and burning them. This was basically in opposition to what they were calling idol worship, a common theme in Protestant revivals. Now, obviously, this upset the Tsarist authorities, and by the 1870s, they had begun roughing up these Shtundists. The local police often hired drunks to go and beat them up, follow them to their church services, which were held in private homes, disrupt the services, but by the 1880s, the new Tsar was very reactionary, and it really reached a head when they started deporting them to prisons, taking their homes, actually very likely killing quite a few of them, and by the late 1880s they saw the opportunity to immigrate to America, and quite a few of them settled right here in Kief, North Dakota. Do you still speak any Russian or German or Ukrainian or?
No, I don't. We were taking German in school, but then there was not enough kids to take it, so we never got to take German. And Russian, there was this guy out here, Sokolenko, or Sokomlin. He was a Russian teacher for the Russians.
There's an odd relation between the Shtundist Ukrainians and other Ukrainian American communities here on the High Prairie. Kief was Shtundist, but places like Wilton or Belfield were a different variety of Ukrainian. The immigrants in Kief were cordial to these communities, but as Protestants, they were a bit wary of Catholicism. They looked to these other Ukrainian communities and found drinking and dancing all things that they thought were a pathway straight to hell, unlike the Ukrainians outside of the Protestant community. In Agnes Palahniuk's interviews, one man from Max, North Dakota, said that when he was younger, people would ask their elders, "What are we?" The older generation would say, "We're Russians." However, among themselves, they would say that they were Ukrainians. Likewise, when local school kids would strike up friendships with Ukrainian children in these communities, the Shtundists, they would usually say that we're Russian Baptists, hence the name of the church right here in Kief. Among themselves, however, they would say we are evangelical Christians or spiritual Christians, or even in private embrace the Shtundist label. Well, can you tell me a little bit about Kief, just how the town came to be and its rise and fall?
It was like the Mikolankos, the Sokolenkos, Torsenkos, Karpenkos, all the Boloshenkos. They kind of had different things, and then I have a picture of the town from back on a cookbook here. It's just right up in the kitchen here. I'll have to maybe so you can put that on.
Oh yeah, I'll put it in the video. This is the old abandoned church. I believe this is the Lutheran church in Kief, right down the road from the community grain elevator. And last time I checked, this community had fewer than a dozen people still living in it. Could you tell me a little bit about how this community came to lose a lot of members? Someone was saying the grain elevators left in the 90s and the store in the 80s.
Yeah, the store burnt down, so that was one thing. And then they put down, Benny Krieger opened up. Oh yeah, there's Kriegers too. Benny Krieger opened up a store, just main things that he would, anybody that would need, he didn't go outrageous and stuff. So that was pretty good. And you could always call him and ask him if he had anything, had any left, like milk or whatever. And so, or we just go up there and stuff, and a lot of them visited there too.
We're heading now to the community cemetery for Kief, North Dakota. Through these trees is the Liberty Baptist Church, the Russian or Ukrainian Shtundist church, and here is the cemetery. Many early pioneers and settlers who would go on to have very large families are buried here, so kind of interesting from a genealogical perspective. And you can see here the grave of Sam Karpenko on the right, buried next to his wife Irene. When he died in 1986, he was over 80 years old. And this is the grave of Mike Karpenko, whose son Sam ran the general store until it burned down in 1981. Mike was born in 1867. At the time, that was South Russia, so near Odessa most likely. And actually, very oddly, right outside of the Kief cemetery, we've got the separate plot for the Bokovoy family over here. Early settlers, and I'll kind of detail their story a little bit more up by their graves. In 2019, the Voice of Russian-Speaking America published an article about Kief. The author talks about the grandmother of Divine Henriksen, who lived here about 50 years ago. According to Divine, the town was founded by Christina and Anton Bokovoy. They were originally from the Ukrainian capital, at that point with the same spelling, Kief. Husband and wife professed Protestantism, and at the beginning of the 20th century, Kiev was part of the Russian Empire, where the Russian Orthodox Church dominated. Supporters of other religions were persecuted. Having fled from Kiev in 1889, Anton and his associates were looking for a place where they could freely pray and cultivate the land. The United States turned out to be a suitable country, a perfect opportunity. At that time, North Dakota was handing out land to anyone who was ready to settle and create a vibrant community.
But then the elevator, I think at the time, I think the manager passed away, and that's been quite a few years ago, and stuff, and they couldn't get one, and then they got somebody to run it and stuff, and then everything was going, going downhill or whatever.
Once a vibrant Ukrainian-American community, there's not even 24 people living here. There were several hundred people who called this place home back around the end of World War I, the Great Depression, but obviously changing times have forced almost every one of them out. We're looking down Main Street here. To the left is the town hall, one of the remaining businesses, and then on the left side of the road, a little bit further up, you've got some abandoned churches, and at the end of this road, right as it turns to the right, if you turn left, you've got the community cemetery that has a lot of interesting immigrant graves. And here is one of the original immigrants to the community, Evdokia Sokolenko, whose homestead still has pictures on the internet, although it's long since fallen into disrepair. And the Sokolenko family was pretty large. Here is John Sokolenko, who lived to be 66 years old. You say Baptist, but I've also heard them described as a unique Baptist, as the Shtundists,
Yeah, Baptists over there. Yeah, yeah. Okay, that would have been. Now see, Elaine, my cousin, she was married to some of those. So she would know more about that too, because she's 9 years older than I am. So she would have known about that. So that would have been Gene Spitchke. Those Spitchies and all that stuff would have been, they went to church here. A lot of them go to church here.
And throughout the back of these cemeteries, very sadly, just around the time of the Great Depression, you've got a lot of very young graves, born 1920, died in 1926. These were all disease outbreaks that just devastated the prairie. Here is a woman who died young, Fedorenko. Oddly enough, I haven't been able to find any information on the death of these two brothers, Mark and Alex Karpenko, but they both died on the same day, June 28th, 1925, leading me to think perhaps some kind of a farming accident. And also very interesting, because these are Ukrainians who took a lot of inspiration and kind of married into the German community, the Black Sea Germans. In the back of this cemetery is a very distinctive German wrought iron cross, kind of famous across North Dakota. If you had any message to say to Ukrainians or Russians or Germans, because a good international community watches my YouTube channel, what would you tell them, like as a Ukrainian American or a Russian American? Just like your message from North Dakota to overseas.
It's fun living in a big such a big town of 7.
Is that the real population, 7 people?
I think so. It's Richard and Emmy. It's 2. Us 2. Jerry here, 5. And Debbie and Keith Olson. That's 6, 7, yeah.
And this is the A&R shop right next to the town hall on Main Street here in Kief.